Hi, Randy. Nice to be here again. And thank you for inviting me to talk about Latin American issues.
Um, there's been in the news recent assassination of an Ecuadorian candidate. I don't think he was the top of the list. I think there are like 8 candidates running. There's a kind of a spot election August 20. Um, there's the current president, I think, is kind of center right, Lasso, and likely to be succeeded by Luisa Gonzalez from the left. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or kind of quick takes.
Well, this is a very, very sad and important issue in Ecuador and also in Latin America, because this candidate was a journalist, a very well known journalist. He had a very strong approach on the narco drug trafficking issues. He was a very outspoken person. He got a lot of support. I don't know if he was going to win, but a lot of support uh, on the public opinion of Ecuador uh, because he was a very, very strong against the leftist former president Correa,
Mhm.
and it represents this assassination represents a kind of very terrible picture of politics in some of Latin American countries, where you find entrenched uh, drug trafficking, criminal gangs, and political issues. And this represents also what I have been reading recently, the power of criminal gangs. You know, some of the people that perpetrated this assassination were Colombians,
Hmm.
meaning that they were recruited in Colombia by the gangs, criminal gangs, probably uh, linked to drug cartels to assassinate this journalist and presidential candidate. I think uh, now Ecuador is going to have elections in August this month, in just a few days, in 10 days, uh, in and this is something very ominous on the landscape of Ecuadorian and Latin American politics.
No, I agree. This is just a brief, um, story. People can see his name, Fernando Villavicencio.
Villavicencio.
Thought there was one interesting part here, which I'll highlight. An FBI delegation will arrive in the country in the next few hours. This bloody incident prompted Ecuador's President Guillermo Lasso to request help from the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. I think that's kind of an interesting and telling moment, um, that he may not trust his own, and look for an external, potentially more neutral force. I'm not sure the FBI has been neutral in our own politics, but they may very well be a better arbiter for politics abroad. Um, that kind of brings up the I think the thorn for a good part of Latin America, particularly of the left, is Big Brother, United States, as having a love-hate relationship with, there's so much domination. Sometimes I think Latin America feels like the tail of the United States dog, that we wag it rather than vice versa. Tell me whether, I don't know if you see any meaning in that. Why did he ask for the FBI to come in? Is there trust for the nation's own institutions, or has there been kind of a thorough corrupting?
Well, what I have been seeing on the news about this assassination is that there are a lot of suspicious situations around the candidate. Why he was not in an armored car? Why some of the bodyguards were not there? And of course, when you have that situation, you become suspicious about their own uh, bodyguards and police guards that he might have had. And uh, and it's not unusual in our countries to have infiltration from the guns into the police and into the military. That's why there, I suppose, there is a pledge of collaboration from the FBI to Ecuadorian police, and also uh, today and yesterday there was a gathering between the FBI, the Colombian police, and the Ecuadorian police around this sad situation in Ecuador. So collaboration is frequent frequent amongst these police forces, and also there is some kind of tradition of collaboration from the DEA in Latin America about drugs. In many countries there are groups of the DEA officials in collaboration with national police drug enforcement agencies. So I don't see that as something weird or unusual or strange to what has been collaboration of police forces in Latin America with U.S. agencies.
Fair enough. There are two general themes I'd like to, that strike me, and I assume you as well, but maybe you can elaborate or strike down my thought that there's kind of a confluence. The major powers in Latin America seem to be the left up, getting stronger and consolidating across multiple countries, and this kind of narco stream. Um, the I'm not I don't have the exact scorecard in front of me, but kind of the wave of Evo Morales, Hugo Chavez, Lula has succeeded and been succeeded by generations across the board. And Colombia, which I think was for the most part a bastion of center right governments, that seems to me that there's a large swath of Latin America that is falling under the left banner of populism and so forth, ranging from potentially the better version, maybe Mexico's Obrador, to the worst version of Maduro. Can you give me a scorecard, and can you tell me, thumbs up, thumbs down, how are things proceeding, progressing, and does this kind of align with kind of a growth of the narco state, and is do they kind of dance with the devil? I just make a for a long question even longer. Petro is now succeeded Duque in Colombia, and he's the first, I think, leftist leader in Colombia in I don't know, a couple generations maybe. Former member of FARC, the Fuerza Armada for the Revolution in Colombia. And he's dealing now with ELN, which is even, I think, more rabid and rigid Marxist-Leninist. So that's a long question. So what's going on?
That's not a question. That is a statement.
Fair enough. Okay, so the question would be, do you agree with any of what I just said? What is the scorecard? What are the countries that are not left of center in Latin America? And is there a coalescence and a consolidation or coalition between these countries? And as we've noticed, perhaps, say, between Colombia and Venezuela of late, which had not been the case.
We tend as analysts to say that Latin America is moving from one ideological pattern to another. But if you see what has happened in this quarter of century recently in Latin America, is that many countries have gone from the left to the right and again to the left, and some others to the right again. So I tend to think that these changes are not mainly by ideological reasons, that the population is moving from the left to the right. I think the main force behind all these changes is discontent. Even discontent when they elect one government, like Petro, for instance, in Colombia. He won the majority last year. He was sworn in August 7th of 2022. He had just 1 year in office, and now his disapproval is going to 53% recently. So what you see, the engine behind everything is discontent. That's one thing. But also there are leftist government now in Latin America. They are the majority of the government, and uh, you cannot put all of them in the same bag. Why? Because there is a kind of left vegetarian sector. You will say Boric in Chile, that is, a leftist guy, but also very respectful of human rights, at least in his speech and ideas and what he says everywhere. And you have this carnivorous left that is represented by Maduro, the Cubans, and Ortega in Nicaragua. You have is not the same. In some countries, there are, fair respect for institutions, for the rule of law. I would say Chile is the main example of this leftist regime or government that is respectful of the law. Also Petro so far, and others, in the middle range, like Lopez Obrador in Mexico or Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, and that big question that is Lula in Brazil, that we don't know where is he going to, but he is not Chavez or Maduro or the Diaz Canel in Cuba or Ortega in Nicaragua. He is a different guy. So what you have is a group of leftists that are not behaving the same. And one element of definition is the relations to Maduro in Venezuela. For instance, Petro has been, trying to get along with Maduro. They share ideological views in many senses. They're both friends of Cuban revolution or Cuban leaders, but they have differences. For instance, Maduro's regime a few weeks ago disqualified for participating in any elections for 15 years the front runner in the polls in Venezuela, who is Maria Corina Machado, a brave woman that is running for office next year, and he's the front runner for the primary of the opposition in October. Well, Petro, when she was disqualified, uh, like 3 weeks ago, for 15 years, think on that. Petro said in a tweet, I I think these kind of measures cannot be taken by administrative reasons. as many other leaders in the world. And I think that presents a difference of how people approach, and leaders and presidents and governments, to some of the issues in the region. Boric, for instance, the president of Chile, has been very, very tough in relation to Maduro about the way in which he is handling human rights in Venezuela. So you have to uh, analyze it case by case in regarding to these issues. Of course, all of them are share thoughts about the role of the United States in the world, what they call imperialism, uh, even now call imperialism, U.S. presence in the world. They share the idea that the state should be a strong state, and that is a institution, that a set of institutions that can bring wellness to the people, and the like. But in political terms, they are different.
Fair enough. Well, that was a good answer. Um, there's the old expression, one man, one vote, one time. Um, the question, for some of these democracies is whether there is the allowance for other parties to come into power thereafter. And I'm wondering whether you see any possibility. Obviously, if in the case of Venezuela, if the opposition candidate is somehow, barred for 50 years, which is a lifetime basically.
15.
Oh, I'm sorry, 15, which is still a political lifetime.
Yeah, of course.
How can those places be considered democracies? How is it that, and I know you're expert on this, how is it that a democracy can be altered from within? I don't really like the term democracy. I prefer republic, because a democracy, I don't think there are any true democracies where everything gets voted by referendum like the Greeks in Athens had at one point. I think it's not really a workable situation. We need some framework upon which to rest and have it. But how is it that the underpinnings of the constitutional republic that was Venezuela were so thoroughly dismantled up by Chavez and then continued by Maduro? And what are the openings thereof? And are there other tendencies going on throughout Latin America? And again, I think it's usually from the left. That's my own perhaps bias or perhaps historical observation that these elections don't tend to be free, and they tend to be manipulated. What are the prospects in Venezuela for kind of an internal retaking by true popular vote of the body governing, and what are the tendencies in other places of Latin America? I see we're kind of putting Chile in its own little special case, but in this kind of gray zone, what do you see?
Well, I think should be a discussion, and there are some of them in the academic realm and other places, about the future of democracy. Because in some regions in the world, you find that democracies tend to be weak, tend to be fragile, and people, at least some percentage of the population, tend to think that democracy is not worth to keep. That's a real thing.
It's not worth what?
Huh?
I'm your last sentence.
It's not worth to keep.
It's not worth keeping. Okay.
Because democracies don't fulfill its promises, because democracy don't give well-being to the population and the like. What's that? That offers of politicians in the electoral campaigns most of the time are not fulfilled when they are in office. And these people get Discontent, that's not strange in history, but nowadays in many countries, that discontent leads to try to change governments before finishing their terms by impeachment, by popular protest, by many other resources. And even in some countries, resorting to the military, asking them to intervene for changing regime. So there is a problem between, I would say, between what people expect and what people get from
Yeah.
Democracy.
Yeah. Well,
In some countries, people understand, well, I'm discontent, but I have to wait until the elections. But in other countries, that's not the case. People want to change now.
well, I think there are a couple things at play. You know, I'm reminded of a couple different things when you're speaking. First of all, H.L. Mencken, who's kind of the successor of Mark Twain, I quote this quite a bit, but he said, democracy is the principle by which the people vote for what they want and they deserve to get it, good and hard. So he's making a joke there. The early 20th century United States. But the other one is a line from Jonah Goldberg, who wrote probably 20 years ago, that the countries with low voter turnout are generally the better countries to be in. If you have a voter turnout that's 100%, obviously that's false. But a lot of places where people don't really care to vote, it's because the government is not the biggest thing in their lives. And so, you know, these days, I think we tend to look at, I think the world is becoming more secular, less religious, and we're not really looking towards more the spiritual world for our fulfillment, but we're looking for the materialist world. And I think government tends to be not the only, but the biggest player, you know, kind of the elephant in the room that people can't ignore, and therefore they have to have a lot of sway in this. And I think conversely, governments have figured out that democracy can be hacked by getting activists, you know, kind of paying people in a sense, one way or another, through power and influence to motivate the vote. And I think there's a lot of vote capture. There's a lot of ballot harvesting. I think there's some questions about, you know, the recent election in Brazil, the way that the votes totals came in, kind of overwhelmingly in certain areas. Blah blah blah. The thing I'm curious about, I guess, to get away from statements to get into questions, is what is the level of the what is the nature of the discontent? You know, my own tendency, my feeling is, you know, I'm happy doing a bunch of other things. I'm happy not thinking about government. I'd like to play tennis. I like to do work. I like to talk with people. I like to do, you know, my own commerce, my own business. I want government to be out of the way. When government starts to take up more and more of my attention and time, if I have to pay a tax every 2 minutes, if I have to ask the government if I want to, you know, if I can travel, if I have to ask the government, you know, to have a job, when I see my job and my prospects diminishing because of governmental actions, then I take the action. But I think it's not the first recourse and the first direction of people to yell at the government. So when there is discontent, what is the nature of that discontent that you think is happening in these countries? And is it because the government is infringing upon people's basic rights and interests and their say right to pursue quiet, peaceful happiness on their own outside of government influence?
Well, this is a very interesting approach, the one you have right now, because it shows, you know, that your life doesn't depend on the government, doesn't depend on, you know, of the decision of the president that is in the White House. Your life is full of other things that are not related to the government, to the national or even state level government. But in some countries, the quality of life, health, education, services depend in a high level from the government. And when you are in some countries, even the food you have in your table depend on the government. For instance, in Venezuela, there is a bag of food that people might get if they are registered in a national registry of for having those bags
Hmm.
called clapped. So who is there is something that I am interested to know and to follow. In other countries, what you find that's one thing. The other thing is that in many countries you find that the political system brings alternative parties and political leaders in government that are not so different uh, from each other. You know, if the party A is in government, maybe is going to do approximately the same things that the party B when it takes office. And our society is not so polarized. You know, the center, the middle class would say, well, for me is indifferent who is there. But when societies are so polarized, like we have here in the United States and some other countries, you know, politics is everyday life, and people got involved more and try to vote more to halt this guy to come into office or to promote this guy into office. And I think the polarization is an active force for for this situation that you mentioned. And in Latin America, we have had another issue that was put in place not for the first time, but recently was put in place in this historical time uh, by Chavez. He won a fair election. He was clearly the winner of the election, of the presidential election. And soon he adopted the following uh, step. He called the National Constituent Assembly that was not in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court of the ancien regime allowed him to do that. And that National Constituent Assembly declared the first day it gathered, we are the power. We are the absolute power of the country because we represent directly Venezuelan people without any intermediary between the people and the assembly. And as a result of that, that constituent assembly dissolved the judicial power, the Congress, and all the powers that were impeding to control the absolute power. And from that very moment in 1999, all the process that came about was the control of everything. The government first, the institutions of the national state, the institutions of the regional realm, even the municipalities, and three key institutions: the military, the central bank, and the oil industry, PDVSA, that was the main state owned industry. And they got everything: the force of the military, the instrument of printing money that was the central bank, and the resources of oil. They got everything. And some people that saw that didn't have the strength to stop them. And some other people that had at that time the power to do so, to say, no, you cannot continue in this path, simply resignated, because we have to get along with the new government. We don't have, and began to accommodate to that situation, thinking that they could tame the lion in the living room of their homes. And they couldn't. They were eaten.
Yeah, no, this is a cautionary tale. We went through a fair amount of fear in the last few years. We had, in the United States, I think it's been probably overall the most peaceful country, internally, for the last few hundred years. But there were riots on the streets. There were riots in every city, practically every major city. I think there were threats for personal property and health, and there were, Minneapolis burned, and as well as other cities. And then on top of it, we had literal lockdowns, which is a term that had been only used for prisons beforehand. It had never been a term for public health, to lock down for swine flu, to lock down for the Hong Kong flu, to lock down for the Spanish flu. Never. And we've had other, respiratory illnesses and whatnot. And I think, there's the question of whether there is kind of a cheat code, to use the gamer's term. I don't know if you know what a cheat code is, but you basically break the game. If you're playing some long convoluted game, you have a cheat code. You can have everybody. It's kind of like, I think they see it in Star Wars, where they managed to subvert the white guards. The kind of the fascistic white guards in Star Wars by having a secret term. But it seems like, was there a cheat code within is Venezuela unique in it having this kind of opening, this gap, this wormhole that let Chavez, kind of make a national constituent assembly or whatever it was called? And is that a possibility in other places? It seems to me, that potentates and dictates, despots around the world would be envious of this situation. I mean, Castro, I think, had to, actually, make an armed insurrection against his own government to make a revolution. I'm not sure. I'm not a complete expert on revolutions. How Lenin did it, or Vladimir Ilyich, whatever his name was. But how do we avoid this? This is my statement part. I apologize. But during COVID, we saw that democracies actually were fragile. Like parliamentary democracies, my own feeling was that the parliamentary democracies did worse than the, say, more constitutional republics. So, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, these are technically our friends and places of liberty and whatnot. But because they are genuine democracies, they can go and have the majority make all the rules. In the United States, we have more individual provinces, states. I mean, the individual state term, Department of State, what it refers to individual states. And we were formed as individual independent countries that annealed and coalesced to form the United States of America. So we had some preservation of liberty, perhaps in an unequal place, more in Florida than in California, more in North Dakota than in Illinois, that kind of stuff. What is the way of avoiding this for other countries, and what is the way back for Venezuela?
Well, that's a very very important discussion, and there are many approaches to it. For instance, in Venezuela, we have had 27 different constitutions in 200 years, meaning that from time to time, the leaders think they can create a republic. And that reveals weak institutions, because you can call a constituent assembly in any country if that is in the constitution, and the power of that assembly is, limited to what the constitution says a constituent assembly can do. But if you don't have institutions strong enough to force other political or institutional actors to abide by, you can have anything. Colombia, for instance, had a constitutional assembly in 1991. Colombia made a new constitution, very, uh, you know, with very interesting additions like decentralization and other changes. And that country abide by the constitution since then. Uh, but when you have what happened in Venezuela with this constituent assembly that I mentioned, you have, total power without any limits, and that created this environment. I think the main issue for any country is the rule of law. I think that's the foundational setting upon which you can build any change you want. When there is a respect for the rule of law, you have the proper institutions. In no country there is perfect, but you have countries where the respect by the of the justices, of the procedures, of the prosecution process is fairly good. You can stop these threats against democracy. If not, you're done.
So, no, I understand that, but it's kind of a circular argument. You have it or you don't have it. You don't have it. You don't have it. You can't get it if you didn't have it. You have it if you have it, but you might lose it. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, you may lose it, but if you have it, you have to keep it. If you don't have, you have to build it.
No, I understand that. I mean,
and what depends on a very wise leadership that understands that this is needed.
Right. So let me ask you kind of a quasi-historical question. I read some time ago, probably 10, 15 years ago, an article about the land ownership rights that differed between Spanish Americas and English Americas. The British came over and the settlers here in Canada were deeded the land. In the Spanish version of colonialism and settlement, the lands were given to basically the lords and barons and whatever the Spanish terms were, and the land ownership was not was more baronial and feudal in a sense, and referring to kind of the kind of royal structure that was there in Spain, and so the plantations and the land tracts were owned more by individual owners than the several split up version that happened in the United States. And so as a result, so that's A, and then B, what succeeded from that and proceeded from that is that there were more different smaller landowners in the United States, and they brought themselves up as kind of a middle class that didn't have its distinct same role in Spanish colonial Americas. And so you had a very upper crust, and then you had a bunch of kind of lower workers, and you didn't have the same formidable middle class of land ownership. You had, obviously merchant class and whatnot, but you didn't have the same kind of middle rung of, people invested literally and figuratively in the land and country itself that we had in, say, United States and Canada, which brings about kind of a stronger fabric for preservation of rights and so forth. I think the vast majority of people didn't necessarily feel ownership in a figurative or literal sense as they did in British America.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial difference between the processes in the United States and Latin America, because ownership of the land here in the United States was individual ownership. People coming and getting their lands and working on them, uh, trying to make land to produce. What we know about. In Latin America, the property of the land was that of the crown. And the crown, the king or the queen, will distribute the land, to these guys, to the conquerors, to the priests, to the vice royal, uh, viceroyal viceroys, to the, to the favorites of the crown in the region. So the problem is that you create the conditions later on for a strong, very strong state. And the society was built from top down. In the United States, is the other way around. Small property, strong states at the beginning, and then the national government was a result of an agreement of the states. And that was the path that this country had. That's why civil society, local and state institutions are strong. And that's why in Latin American countries we have a weak civil society. Until recently, that has been becoming more strong or stronger than before. So I would say this is a different process. You have here decentralization from the beginning. Decentralization in Latin America is very recent because the presidents and the governments in Latin America are the resemblance of the caudillos of the 19th century.
Right.
And there is an illusion in Latin American countries according to which the presidents are very powerful. The heirs of the caudillos of the 19th century. And that's not true. Presidents in Latin America are prisoners. Prisoners of the situation that they have created with the promises made in the electoral campaign, prisoners of the budget that they don't manage because they manage just a small percentage of the budget because all the budget is allocated here, there, and there without any control of the president, and is prisoner because the ability and the capacity of formulating new policies is very limited because there are so many vested interests in the countries that they cannot move. They most of the time have to adapt to them. That's something that is pretty different from other countries, European countries and the United States. So I think what we have to do in Latin America is to work in a very decentralized state and also strong promotion of civil society organizations to counterbalance that kind of power, historical power that we have there.
Fair enough. Now that's all well and good. Like you and I could talk about on a personal basis, just to take the body politic and talk about the body personal. So I'm making an analogy here. If I don't know, well, if I'm 50 pounds overweight and my knee hurts, I can work at losing weight. I might be able to do some exercises. Taking the weight off itself might help my knee, so forth. I can help myself. Conversely, if I'm imprisoned, if I'm shackled, and I have leeches attached to my body, and you'd say, you know what, you look so weak and feeble, get up and make your situation better. It's like, what, dude, I'm in shackles. I've got leeches on me. I mean, it's not the same situation. Venezuela, when you have a caged society, the people are in thrall and under the sway of forces that they can't get up off the mat. It's easy, to recommend it, but sometimes you're losing. And when you're losing, your force, your strength, your energy. And it's hard to have the hope and power to change that situation. I kind of don't hold high hope for, Castro in Cuba. I mean, they're both gone. I guess, I don't know if Raul's still hanging around, but for Cuba to change, for Venezuela to change, it seems, that again, the earlier phrase, one man, one vote, one time, happens. And how does this, outside of some external military aspect or some external lever, how does this change? And can we all change, by just kind of wishing it, by wishing our shackles off and so forth? And I'd like to segue into, another point before, we run out of time, about kind of the other states that are running in parallel to the states, the narco states. But I'm going to save that question. So how do we wish Venezuela, for instance, a better future when it's shackled?
Well, in the case of Venezuela and that of Cuba are different cases from what I am depicting historically. Are different cases because there are authoritarian, very strong authoritarian regimes where you don't have human rights. You have a lot of people prosecuted by their political beliefs. The situation of dictatorships and autocracies. And of course, the elections are rigged by the government. And you would say, well, how can you compete to get rid of the government if the elections are controlled by the government? Fidel Castro used to say that the most democratic country in the world was Cuba because he was having elections, frequently, of course, elections in which only could participate the Communist Party.
And
And
100%, 100% voter turnout.
No, not so exaggerated. So just 99%.
Yeah, thank you.
And but in the case of Cuba, experts in survival and political survival, you have to analyze it in historical terms. It was an agreement between the Soviet Union, the US government, and Cuba that guaranteed Cuba to stay with that kind of government, since the missile crisis in the 1960s. That was a different process. And that outcome was, to continue having Cuba there forever, almost. And in that process, many people flew from Cuba and abandoned political struggle. It is not the case yet in Venezuela, although there is a strong migration. There is a internal and external struggle for democracy in Venezuela. And the conditions for change are three: strong social movement that is now getting momentum again with the leadership of Maria Corina Machado. Secondly, the role of the military. There are military officers thinking that they should abide by the Constitution and the laws, not intervening as a political force. We don't know what is going to happen with that. So far, they have been obedient to the government. Could that change? That's a question mark for the future. And thirdly, the role of the international community, mainly the United States, Spain, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico. And would those countries push with enough strength to oblige Maduro to open for democratic change? That's also a question mark there. Without these three elements, there will be no change.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the actors you pick for the international community, I mean, I think only maybe Spain has kind of maybe the similar interest from, say, you know, 8-10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, whatever. I think Colombia, Mexico, United States have all had, you know, regime change in the meanwhile. And I think you know, their interest is not where it would or should or could be, probably should be.
But let me say, Randy, one thing. Some of these governments might, you know, resemble as similar to Maduro's interest, but they are not the same. Their leaders don't want to be in a picture with Maduro.
I don't know about that.
I
know
about that.
Obama was in a picture with Maduro. He was in a picture with Raul Castro, and you know, George W. Bush and Donald Trump were not. You know, I think things matter. I think I understand this kind of the blur of the uni-state, uni-party state, whatever, that these parties blur. I think there are differences, and I think
let me say, yes, there are differences, but at some point in the 1990s, in Latin American terms, there was the idea that Fidel Castro, because the situation in Cuba was so bad, would need to go back to Latin America and to open Cuba for some changes. And many presidents, or some presidents, President of Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, and Panama, tried to bring back Cuba to the Latin American community. Was the idea that could be done at that time, and they have to be in pictures with Fidel Castro because they thought there was an opportunity. What happened? That in that process, you know, happened a red miracle that Chavez took office in Venezuela and began to pump oil.
Yeah, they pump money. Yeah, it's craziness. You know, there's an old joke. You can you put it in for, you know, North Korea, I think, or any number of these places, Cuba, whatever. So the joke is, what did they have before candles in North Korea?
What they did have.
What did they have before candles in North Korea?
I don't know.
Electricity.
Good joke.
And so you know, the joke pertains, you know, to Chavez pumping, you know, oil out of the ground with the erstwhile, you know, ability to do so based on you know, having a functional oil industry, and then it just disappears. You know, these places are ground to dust. You know, we've mentioned this on the last episode, but Venezuela in the 1960s was, I think, the fourth wealthiest country on earth. You know, up there with Switzerland, the United States, and obviously the wealthiest country in Latin America, and now probably the poorest. You know, maybe give or take. I mean, Bolivia is not that great. Whatever.
No, it's the poorest along with Haiti.
Yeah, and then that's in the Americas, and that's really, you know, no offense to those countries, but that's rock bottom. what it's not just politics left and right. It's the impoverishment of the people. It's the enslavement of the people, and it's the lack of guarantee. I mean, we talk about human rights and rule of law. Now, these things are not static, immovable objects. These fall under the sway of potentates and people who look out, who under the guise and under the rubric of helping the people, help themselves, and the people suffer. Certainly their people might do better than other people, but it becomes very much a zero-sum game, and all the sums are being collected by those in power from these national constituent assembly types and their dragoons, their thugs on the street who enforce order, and possibly some cronies from the state, but the people are left behind, and I think we're seeing this more in the way that the narco world, and I have some kind of a sympathy for the people there who fall into the sway of the narco states, as some complicity, I guess, and compunction, because the narco states would not exist if people did not want narco. If the people in Europe and Australia, the United States, did not have a demand for cocaine, for heroin, and all these other things, then these trades wouldn't exist. The human soul is a dark place sometimes, and people feed these things, and they don't really see the fruits or the lack of fruit of their labor. When they purchase the cocaine or purchase the heroin and so forth, that is causing upheaval and dismay and potential bondage and slavery in a lot of the producer countries. It's an interesting point. I don't have the full answer to that. I'm not sure legalization is the right answer on a societal basis, but these kind of illicit trades are destabilizing. I'm wondering whether you might want to speak to some of the aspects that are going on, say, in the border states between Colombia and Venezuela. I think.
Well, I have to leave right now, Randy, and I don't have that much time to answer that. But
Okay.
I would say there is Venezuela in 2021, and I think is still in that position, was ranked 139 out of 139 countries on rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
Was the last country on the rule of law. What has happened in the country? That there are several criminal gangs taking power, territory, infiltrating institutions, and also in Colombia. But and it has been created what is a gray zone in the borders between Colombia and Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
That's a third country.
Yep.
With their own rules, with their own police, mainly on the side of Venezuela, because the ELN has had sanctuary in Venezuelan border.
Mm-hmm.
So you have there, other norms, other bylaws made by these groups that are infiltrated by the narco traffic, and they're linked to the guerrillas groups, and that's the real power in the border.
Yeah. There's a map here. So I'm going to let you go. I'm going to. This is an interesting article on InsideCrime.org. I also want to close with your Amazon page. You have a book here. It's in Spanish still, but you have other books about Venezuela. People recommend people check out your page on Amazon. There's Revolution and Disillusion, and as well, I have a page if you want to help support my podcast and video cast. I don't have a Patreon or anything like that, but you can buy my book, hopefully read it as well. Overturning Zika. This actually is about Brazil, a little bit about Colombia, other parts of Latin America, Venezuela, which did not experience the microcephaly that Brazil did, which I think was a panic-generated side effect in a sense based on bad science. So this is Overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. It's got my picture for the same price. You can buy this book on Amazon. It's got good reviews. I'd like you to read it and review it. And that's going to pretty much close out our show for today. Thank you so much, Carlos.
Thank you, Randy, for having me.
And say goodbye to everybody else. Ta-ta.